A warning for listeners that this series contains graphic details, including references to murder and rape. I'm standing in front of the Melbourne Magistrates Court, and it was inside a courtroom here last year where Perry Karumblis was told in front of the families and supporters of Suzanne Armstrong and Susan Bartlett that he would be standing trial for their murders. Suzanne's sister Gail Armstrong came all the way down from the country to be there for every single day of that process, to look at Perry face to face as a magistrate heard all the evidence and Perry's defence that would be presented if the case went to trial. This court was also where we learned a lot more about the people in the two Sues' lives and about the sort of world they were living in 48 years ago.
This is Victoria's most serious cold case and longest cold case.
47 years after the Easy Street double murders, charges have finally been laid today.
Right now, the main suspect in one of Australia's most notorious double murder cold cases is in the air on a flight back to Melbourne.
Perry Karumblis fronted court today, charged with 2 counts of murder and 1 count of rape.
My name is Olivia Jenkins, and I'm a crime reporter at the Herald Sun. And this is Hunting Justice, the Easy Street Murders. In this series, we'll take you behind the murder investigation and the gruelling DNA search to find Suzanne and Susan's killer. We'll take you through more about what was said at Perry Karumblis' committal hearing next episode. But for now, we need to tell you about the Melbourne that the two Sues found themselves in the late 70s and the home they set up on Easy Street.
To viewers right throughout Australia. Greg, the captain of North Melbourne, has won the toss and they're kicking to the eastern end of the ground. Your umpires for the 76 grand final.
In January 1977, Hawthorn fans were still celebrating their Victorian Football League grand final win over North Melbourne.
We've discussed
and Malcolm Fraser had just been re-elected for another term as Australia's Prime Minister.
North-South issues.
ABBA, Elton John and Queen are all dominating the Aussie music charts.
And I used to sing in the shower, like my mum would say, Bon, if you can't sing proper songs, shut up. Don't sing this rock and roll garbage.
AC/DC are just over 3 years into their journey to becoming one of the most iconic Australian rock bands of all time. And Skyhooks is taking off too. And it's hot. The peak of Australian summer. Temperatures are reaching a scorching 35 degrees Celsius. And by then, Suzanne Armstrong and Susan Bartlett had settled into their new neighbourhood. It wasn't fancy, by any means. It was a largely working class area that about 16,000 people called home, where battlers lived in tiny flats and worker cottages. And it was mostly made up of migrants from Greece, Italy, Macedonia and Vietnam, who had settled there between the 50s and 70s. It was also the place a teenager who would go on to become an accused killer called home.
He walked around like a little bit hunched or something, like he was hiding a little bit or a bit shy or something.
That's Kate Buck. She owned a vintage clothing store in the middle of Collingwood in the late 70s, and you'll hear more from her soon. But the boy she's talking about is Perry Karumblis, the man charged over the Easy Street murders. And he and the two Sues were living within metres of one another, right in the centre of an area with its own hidden secrets.
Those inner suburbs, Fitzroy and Collingwood and Abbotsford and Richmond and Port Melbourne and South Melbourne, they were pretty rough and tough in the 70s. And there were plenty of, a large number of the criminal classes lived around Collingwood and Richmond. Fitzroy and Collingwood were tough and rough. A lot of those guys carried knives.
That's veteran crime writer and podcaster Andrew Rule.
It is said by some that there was nothing you could not buy from the Collingwood Housing Commission flats, including machine guns. There were fur coats, there were, cars that had been stolen and rebirthed, whatever.
Just a black market.
It was a big black market at those flats. So it was a pretty rough, tough place, and there are a lot of rough, tough streets and a lot of rough, tough people, and bad things happened in those inner suburbs in ways that we now see a lot further out.
By the late 70s, Andrew had been working in newspapers for a couple of years, but he'd already seen quite a lot on the police beat.
It was a tough time in the 70s. There were gangs of skinheads and sharps and all the rest of it roaming around, and they used to fight it. I mean, we've got gangs now, but we had gangs then. We had the Lebanese Tigers, and we had the Broady Boys, and we had the Ringwood Sharps, and some very tasty guys from at Jordanville, which is out near Waverley. And all these guys used to, and the girls with them, would come in on the trains and go to the footy and do this and that, and they'd have big fights. And there was a lot of tough stuff went on.
The sharpies are not allowed in dances because they know they're always fighting that, so they don't let them come in dances. So
Andrew was also a lot closer to this case than perhaps he realised growing up.
Funnily enough, I found out recently that the Armstrong, Susan Armstrong, she came from a family up around Euroa way, and it turns out that my mother had known, and my grandmother and grandparents had known the Armstrongs up there when my grandparents had lived there at one time. And in fact, I just found out recently, my aged mother told me that her mother, my grandma, had made or iced the wedding cake for the Armstrongs. Susan Armstrong, that was murdered at Easy Street. Her parents were Mr. and Mrs. I think Bob Armstrong from near Euroa, and when they got married back in the late 40s or thereabouts, my grandmother had iced the wedding cake, which was a big thing in those days. They'd make up icing and do all these tiered cakes and all that, lots of decoration, and she'd done that, and they knew them fairly well, and sufficiently well that when I was a kid in the 60s, living out in the bush, we got these visitors one weekend, and it was the Armstrongs from Euroa. And there was I remember this couple that just didn't mean much to me, but they had a dark-haired girl of about my age, which might have been 9 or something. And I remember her sitting glumly in our living room, sort of kicking her legs and looking around the room. She was not Suzanne. Suzanne was older. That was Suzanne's younger sister, Gail, for sure. And I remember that happening because we didn't get many visitors. So it's a small world that, you know, a terrible murder like that happens, one of the worst in Australia. And I find out my family knows that family.
Andrew says the streets were a lot meaner by the time he hit his stride as a reporter in Melbourne in the 70s. And in that era, women my age, in their 20s, as Suzanne Armstrong and Susan Bartlett were, would had to have put up with all sorts of deplorable behaviour from men.
If you'd been your age walking around the streets of Collingwood in 1977, you would have been wolf whistled, ogled, insulted, people would have grabbed at you. All that sort of stuff would have happened in ways that you would find quite shocking now. That would have happened then, for sure. And it wasn't regarded as so shocking then. It was sort of what happened. It was very different. When women walked past building sites in those days, they were whistled and yelled at and all that sort of baloney.
But Collingwood's a bit different now. Years of gentrification have made this place a haven for hipsters and young professionals. It's full of cafes, bars, vintage shops and live music venues, a far cry from the working class neighbourhood that the two Sues found themselves in. Here's Andrew Rule again.
Collingwood in 1977, I remember it well because it's about the time I got to Melbourne from the country, and now and again I'd come and brave the inner suburbs, which in those days were very, very different. This is just as it's Carlton starting to be gentrified. By the time I started work in newspapers in 1979, 80, I knew people that were buying houses in Carlton for $30,000, which was a few dollars then, $30,000 or $40,000, and doing them up. But they were buying what had been essentially sort of slums or houses owned by poor people and then gentrifying them.
While Suzanne picked up odd jobs, Susan went back to work at the Collingwood Education Centre, which you heard about briefly in the previous episode. The school has a long history, It was originally established in 1882, and in my efforts to find out more about it, I came across an old, yellowing book that was buried in the shelves at the Victorian State Library. It's full of original planning documents and details about the school's renovations dating back to the 1950s. The school only taught girls until 1969, but in 1970, most of its original campus was destroyed in a fire. Students were bussed out to neighbouring schools until 1973, when everyone was moved into 26 portable classrooms in the Darling Gardens in Clifton Hill, another suburb next to Collingwood that's now just as sought after in the real estate market. Susan Bartlett first joined the school in 1972, and after her time abroad with Suzanne in 1973, she resumed teaching her art classes right at the back of the school, where portables were set aside for crafts, typing and art. The students back then were a mix of Aussies, Greeks and other European heritage, and some of them tell me they could never forget the firm but fair Miss Bartlett.
When she first became our teacher, we thought, my gosh, she's so strict, because a lot of the teachers weren't strict, but she was one of the stricter ones. We just thought she's always pissed off with us, but of course she was, because we didn't do anything. Poor lady. And so she's spending all her time with the Greek girls. But they were really enthusiastic and, compliant and everything.
We'll call this student Mary. She wanted to talk about her time as one of Miss Bartlett's students, but we're not using her real name to protect her privacy because of the nature of her work.
This school was magnificent. It was like state of the art. And we didn't realise it was a sort of like a pilot program, because our school was not like any other school in Melbourne.
From what Mary says though, Miss Bartlett was one of the most dedicated and well-intentioned teachers in the area when, well, not all of them were, to say the least.
There was parties with the teachers and the students from this school.
So teachers and students together?
Yes.
Okay, in Collingwood?
Yes, at the teachers' houses.
Really?
Yes, and there was some stuff going on between teachers and students.
Very different time compared
Smoking dope.
Looking back, without that sort of teenage defiance we've all had growing up, Mary says she can see why it took so long for her and Miss Bartlett to connect.
A lot of students didn't like Susan Bartlett.
Why do you say that?
Because, when I say we didn't like her, only because she was strict.
So she was doing her job?
Yeah, exactly. We were kids and like I said, with the Greek population, so in her class, it says she was an art teacher, but she wasn't really our art teacher. We had teachers for art, but she was threads and textiles only.
So different categories
of
creative.
It's still art, but she didn't teach us painting or drawing. There was another teacher who did that. But she was a threads and textiles teacher. And in our class, there was the Aussie kids and then the Greek kids, even though we did hang out together, but this was in Form 2, 1976. So it sort of took a little while to establish those friendships with the Greek kids. So there was a group of Greek girls in the art, threads and textiles. There weren't many boys in the class. And they were very compliant and wanted to do the right thing. So she gave all her attention to them. And I think they were sewing, like making clothes or something, with sewing machines. And we just sat there and did nothing, like just chatting, talking about what we're going to do on the weekend or whatever. So she didn't really give us a time of day. And she was strict. But if you didn't want to work, she didn't care. So it was sort of, but she'd just sort of, and she'd sit on her stool and just watch us.
But for Mary, all of that changed one day.
One day she said, we're going to make a patchwork quilt. And we had to cut out these little templates, cardboard templates, like hexagons. And we had to hand sew these little piece of material onto them, and then we'd sew the pieces together. So my friend and me, we got right into that. But then she'd sort of help us, but she would never help unless we asked for help.
Mary could tell you just about anything you'd want to know about the rich history of Collingwood High and the local area. Her mother still lives around the corner from the Two Sues Easy Street house. But for Mary, a teenage Perry Corumblus flew under the radar, and he didn't ring any bells.
Somebody put a photo up of him in a cafe in Fitzroy or something back in the day, and so many comments. They said they don't even remember him.
Yeah, maybe
so he
that was
might
a
have went to
long
Collingwood
voted.
High. He might. See, I started 75, and we moved to this school 75, but I can't remember what month. It was near the end of the year or something.
There have been reports over the years that Perry attended the Collingwood Education Centre, or Collingwood High, as a student. Remember Kate Buck from earlier? She can recall Collingwood's rough and ready scene in the 70s and 80s like it was yesterday. Kate's led an eclectic life, running music labels and fashion stores. But back then, she was right in the thick of Melbourne's punk scene, running her store Eccentric Clothing on Johnston Street.
We sold a lot of handmade punk sort of clothes, which was quite unusual to have a shop like that in 79 and 80. We had fanzines, like homemade photocopied fanzines, clothes that we kind of cut up and dyed. It was just called Eccentric Clothing, and that's kind of what it was. And we also lived out the back of the shop because at night we used to practice in the shop because we were in bands as well.
And it was in this world, in the heart of Collingwood, that she met a young man. But unlike Mary, Kate recognised his look instantly.
The black eyes, it was kind of, he's got these hooded eyes, like they're quite black and sparkly.
It was Perry Corumblus who had walked into her store. It wasn't just Perry's face that stuck in Kate's mind.
By then I was more moved on to punk. But yeah, he definitely stood out with his connies and his droog haircut and the platform shoes.
And one particular group was known for wearing the type of look that Kate's talking about.
Well, he was a Sharpie, which was a peculiar style to Melbourne at the time. But it was mainly in the mid-70s, early mid-70s. So he would have stood out because he was still in that Sharpie gear. I had also been a bit of a Sharpie when I was, like mid-70s, when I was about 15, 16.
The Sharpies were a well-known, homegrown youth subculture that grew out of mid-1970s suburban Australia, and their distinctive subculture had a distinctive style.
The closest thing I could just tell an average person would be like early Bon Scott in AC/DC. He wore those little tight cardigans, the tight jeans, the platform shoes. He had that kind of mullet haircut. That was a real Sharpie look that Bon Scott had. And they were just like gangs, and they liked the same music, which was Billy Thorpe, AC/DC, the Coloured Balls, Lobby Lloyd, bands like that. And there used to be gigs at Festival Hall every Sunday for Sharpies during the 70s. And all those bands would play. And it was just kind of like a big gang. In every suburb, they had their own gang of Sharpies, like Dandenong, Doveton, Lilydale, North Melbourne. Yeah, if you Google Sharpie, you can see that it's pretty much endemic to Melbourne, which I didn't know at the time. And it was in every suburb.
That standout style of Perry's is what still sticks in Kate's mind today.
It was a stripy, very tight woolen cardigan, maybe grey and red stripes with some white, and stripy T-shirts was a thing. He definitely was wearing Sharpie gear. Like nobody else wore those cardigans. It was a specific, you had to go to a special shop to get these connies, and he was wearing them.
And why did his face stick out to you following the news of his arrest? What made you go, that's him, I recognise that face?
The black eyes. It was kind of, he's got these hooded eyes, and they're quite black and sparkly.
2 blocks away from where Kate would open her stall, the Sue's Easy Street place sat as a white, narrow terrace house with a long hallway. It had 3 bedrooms off to one side, 4 you reached the bathroom, and a kitchen at the rear. It had a small backyard area with a laneway running down the right side of the house. The Sues were often spotted walking their dog Benji and visiting the milk bar, which sat opposite their place. They were known as popular and outgoing girls who often had visitors to the home.
The house had been visited over time, over weeks and weeks and weeks, by other people. They'd have dinner parties or whatever, and barbecues, whatever, hot weather, all that stuff. People would come around, and Bernie Balmer had been there. He's later became a very well-known criminal lawyer, Bernie the attorney. In those days, had just not long left school. He'd known Susan Bartlett when she was a teacher at Broadford, and I'm not sure if Bernie actually went to Broadford High for a year or so, or if he did his whole schooling at Assumption College at Kilmore. But either way, it doesn't matter. He left his school jumper that he still had at the house in Collingwood, which is why the police knew he'd been there, because his name was stitched into the collar.
Those visitors also became fuel for vicious gossip.
From what I heard, in the brief time I had a look at this case, there was some nasty rumours that were going around in the 1970s, which there is no indication that any of them were true. But I think that because there was 2 women and there were a number of men that were sort of being looked at as potential suspects or people of interest in this case, there were some nasty rumours.
That was my colleague Anthony Dowsley. You'll be hearing more from him throughout this series. Next door to the 2 Sues at 145 Easy Street, Truth newspaper sports reporter Alona Stevens lived with her housemate, Janet Powell, who part-owned a restaurant in Carlton. Things seemed to be going well for the 2 Sues. Susan had just started dating a man named Ross Hammond, and Suzanne had recently met her new suitor, 31-year-old Barry Woodard, a shearer from Euroa, on Christmas Day in 1976.
Sue's sister Gail is going with Henry. It looked as if we were keeping them in the family.
We've used a voice actor to bring Barry Woodard's words to life here, because that's what he told our newspaper, called The Sun at the time, in the late 70s. Barry's now 80 years old and lives back up in the country in a town called Yea, where he was from originally before coming down to Melbourne. By Monday, the 10th of January 1977, Susan, Suzanne and baby Greg had lived in their Easy Street rental for about 3 months. Suzanne had been out with Barry a couple of times, with baby Greg tagging along. Just before 8 o'clock on that Monday night, the Sues had Susan's brother Martin Bartlett and his girlfriend Vicky Crow over for dinner. After making plans to go back for another dinner on the 18th of January, Martin and Vicky left Easy Street at around 9 o'clock. It's believed Suzanne Armstrong and Susan Bartlett were killed just hours after Martin and Vicky left. Everything that followed is crucial to piecing together exactly what happened to the Sues in that house all those years ago. Barry Woodard, his brother Henry, and Ross Hammond were all there at some point, but not even what they told investigators could help piece together the horror that unfolded inside. Everyone's movements on that night would be put under the microscope. In the next episode.
It was a real shock to imagine people that I knew were in that situation. You always saw the news of things happening, but it was always somebody else, someone else.
It's unbelievable that happened to 2 young people that I knew very well, so I've been at school with for years.
This show is hosted, researched and written by me, Olivia Jenkins. It was produced, edited and written by Jonty Burton. Our video producer is Daniel Coates. Our graphic designers are Kirk O'Dwyer and Sean Lee. Geordie Atkinson is our executive producer. You can find all of our coverage of this case at huntingjustice.com.au. You can also find every article, video and episode of this series, as well as the crime stories Melbourne cares about most, by joining our Facebook group, Herald Sun Crime and Courts. If you have questions, feedback, or something you think we should know, get in touch with us anytime. Our email address is heraldsuncrime@news.com.au,